The night had settled like a blanket over the city, the cool air brushing against the window pane of our small apartment. I stood there, staring out into the night, lost in a web of thoughts I couldn't escape. My fingers gripped the glass as if it might offer some solace, but the truth clawed at me, relentless and insidious. I never expected to find myself in this place. Never thought it would come to this. I should have known better, shouldn't have trusted her so completely, so blindly. Emma, my wife, the woman I married with a heart full of hope. A heart that now felt as though it had been carved out by her betrayal. How could I have missed the signs? The late nights, the distant glances, the unexplained absences. They weren't innocent. Not anymore. I clenched my fists, the tightness in my chest choking out any coherent thoughts. My mind swirled with fragments, bits of conversations, moments that now seemed like clues I had foolishly ignored. But perhaps I hadn't been blind. Perhaps I had known, deep down, and had simply chosen not to confront the unbearable truth. But that was before I learned the full extent of it. Before I discovered who it was. Carter, her boss, the man who, with his sharp jawline and well-tailored suits, had made my insides twist with discomfort since the first time we met. The man who always spoke to her with a confidence I envied. The man who, unbeknownst to me at the time, had been slipping into the very foundation of my life, claiming pieces of Emma that I thought were still mine. I heard the faint sound of her heels clicking against the floor behind me. She was home, her presence a reminder of everything that had begun to unravel. I didn't turn around immediately. I needed to gather my thoughts, needed to steady my pulse before facing her. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice light, almost flirtatious. So she hasn't changed at all, I thought bitterly. Am I? My voice was low, strained, but I couldn't let her see the storm brewing inside me. Not yet. I heard her soft laugh as she dropped her purse onto the table, followed by the rustling of her coat. She was in her usual attire, skin-tight black dress, hair swept up into a messy bun that made her look effortlessly sophisticated. She was beautiful, always had been. But now it felt like a weapon she used to manipulate the world around her, including me. She moved closer, brushing past me, her hand grazing my arm, sending a ripple of something sharp through me. She's pretending. She doesn't know that I know. My body tensed involuntarily at her touch. I couldn't breathe. My thoughts scrambled for the right words, for the right way to confront her. But I had to keep my composure, had to keep this, whatever this was, under control for just a little while longer. Her hand lingered on my shoulder, and I stiffened, slightly, the faint scent of her perfume clouding the air. "You're still so distant. Is something bothering you?" Her tone was the same, casual, innocent even. But I knew better now. I turned slowly, catching her eyes for the first time that evening. God, how could she look at me like that? Those eyes, deep brown, framed by dark lashes, held nothing but the practiced mask of someone who had perfected the art of deception. Did she ever love me? The question stung, but I buried it quickly. "Are you really asking me that, Emma?" I whispered, my voice steady but cold. Her smile faltered just a fraction, but I caught it. The briefest flicker of uncertainty. I took a step toward her, my gaze never leaving hers. The tension between us was thick, suffocating. She wasn't the only one playing a role in this house. I have to play my part, too. Her lips parted slightly, an instinctual response to the pressure I was applying, but she didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her body language, the way her posture shifted, told me everything I needed to know. She's guilty. She knows I know. And she's scared. But she doesn't know what I'm about to do. I swallowed, feeling the cold knot of anger tighten in my gut. There was no more pretending now. No more denial. She had to face what she'd done. We both did. "You're not going to get away with this, Emma," I said, my voice harder than I meant it to be. But it was the truth. Her eyes widened for a split second before she quickly masked it with a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What are you talking about, James?" I stepped back, my mind racing with a plan I had begun to form in the hours before she came home. There would be consequences, but I wasn't going to let her see them just yet. I would make her squirm, make her wonder if she could control the situation. But first, I needed to know just how deep her betrayal went, just how far she was willing to go. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, Emma." I could feel my pulse pounding. In my throat, the adrenaline kicking in as my mind began to sharpen with purpose. I would be patient, but I would me. The night stretched on, heavy with unspoken tension, as we stood in that small, dimly lit room. Emma was no longer smiling. The casual demeanor she had worn for years was slipping, her eyes now darting away from mine as if she couldn't quite meet the full force of what she knew was coming. I could sense her unease, but she had underestimated me. She had underestimated the quiet rage that had been growing within me, that had been fed by her lies, her deceit, and the betrayal she had shared with Carter. "She doesn't know, does she?" The thought stung, but there was no time for sympathy now. It was a game, and I wasn't going to let her outplay me. Her voice trembled, just slightly, as she spoke again, the tension in her words unmistakable. "James, what's gotten into you? I don't understand." I leaned against the door frame, deliberately slowing my breath to calm the fire coursing through me. My fingers twitched with the need to act. But I had learned the hard way that patience was a weapon in itself. I would make her wait, let the uncertainty hang in the air until she was forced to confess, until she couldn't hide behind those shallow excuses anymore. I watched her carefully, noting the way her hands fluttered nervously, the way she licked her lips. Her body language was a silent admission of guilt, the perfect portrait of someone caught in the act, but still holding on to the illusion of control. She thinks she can talk her way out of this. "You've been so good at pretending, Emma," I said softly, the words dripping with a cold mockery. That seemed to catch her off guard. "But I think you've underestimated me, underestimated how much I know." Her eyes flickered, but she quickly regained her composure, her chin lifting with defiance. "What do you think you know, James? You've been distant for weeks now. If you think I've done something wrong, then maybe we should talk about it." It was a calculated move, one I had anticipated, but I wasn't ready to hand her the satisfaction of a direct confrontation. Not yet. She would confess, but only when she felt she had no other choice. I want her to feel the weight of her actions, feel the desperation that comes when the walls begin to close in. I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence between us grow thicker. The sound of her breathing, shallow and rapid now, filled the room. I could see the beads of sweat on her forehead, the slight tremor in her fingers as she reached for the wineglass on the counter. She was cracking. Her fingers tightened around the glass, her gaze shifting uncomfortably away from mine. "You're making this more difficult than it has to be," she said, but the accusation in her voice was weak, too weak. I stepped toward her then, slowly, deliberately, my every movement measured. I could feel her pulse quicken, the air around us thick with an unspoken challenge. Her eyes darted from my face to my hands, her mind clearly racing for an escape route. "Tell me, Emma," I said, my voice dropping low. "How long did you think you could keep this going? How long did you think I would just turn a blind eye?" I didn't wait for her to respond. She had no answer, not one that could save her. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulling out the flash drive I had taken from her purse earlier that evening. The one that contained all the evidence, the emails, the texts, the photos, proof that she and Carter had been more than just colleagues. The moment I placed it on the counter between us, her entire body tensed. Her eyes widened, and I caught the flicker of panic in her gaze. She knew then. She knew the game had changed. "Do you know what this is?" I asked, though I already knew she did. Her silence was confirmation enough. It's not what you think, James," she stammered, her facade crumbling piece by piece. She stepped toward the flash drive as if to grab it, but I held up a hand to stop her. She froze, eyes wide. "No," I said quietly. "Don't bother. You don't get to cover this up. Not this time." I watched her, the woman who had once been my everything, break before my eyes. It was both painful and satisfying, knowing that I had forced her to confront the consequences of her actions. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. But she's not the only one who's going to pay. I turned my attention briefly to the phone on the counter. Carter. He would be next, but for now, I wanted to enjoy the moment of control I held. "You're going to need more than just excuses, Emma," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Because I'm not the same man I was before I knew what you and Carter were doing behind my back." Her lips trembled, and, for the first time in years, I saw a crack in her armor. The guilt was written all over her face, but it wasn't just guilt. It was fear. Fear that the life she had built, the facade she had carefully constructed, was crumbling to dust. The days that followed felt like an endless cycle of quiet tension. Emma and I shared a home, but it was no longer a home. It was a battlefield. There was no warmth between us anymore, no laughter or comfort, just cold, calculated silence. She moved around the apartment, doing the motions of everyday life, but her eyes were distant. Her once warm touch had become a casual brush of indifference. I could see it in the way she avoided looking at me, the way her posture stiffened whenever I entered a room. It was as though she knew I was watching, studying every move, every gesture. And I was. I was hunting for the signs, for the next piece of the puzzle that would expose her for what she truly was. But still she held her ground, her outward composure, never cracking for long. She thought she could outlast me, that the storm inside me would eventually settle. She was wrong. Late one night, I sat in the living room, the flickering glow of the television doing little to distract me from the thoughts swirling in my mind. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as Emma moved upstairs, her footsteps light but deliberate. I knew she was planning something, knew that the guilt from the confrontation hadn't been enough to stop her. She had her own plan now, her own means of escape, and I couldn't let her have that. Not after everything. I wasn't sure how long. I had been sitting there before I heard the familiar sound of her car pulling into the driveway. It was almost midnight, and I had an eerie sense of déjà vu. She had done this before, the late nights, the excuses, the feigned exhaustion. Only this time I wasn't going to wait. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I stood up from the couch, feeling the shift in the air, the tension thickening. I hadn't made my move yet, but I would. The door opened with a creak, and Emma stepped inside, her face flushed from the cold night air. She looked at me quickly, as if gauging whether I had noticed her absence. "It's happening again." "You're late," I said, my voice calm, steady. I had practiced this moment in my mind countless times. I needed to control this, to keep her guessing, keep her on edge. She set her keys down on the table with a light clink and offered me a faint, tight smile. "I had some work to finish." "Up," she explained, her tone breezy, as if everything were normal, but I could see it. I could feel it in the air. The way her eyes darted away from mine, the nervous edge in her voice. She was lying, and I knew it. This time, "I'll catch you, Emma." I studied her as she moved toward the stairs, pretending nothing was out of the ordinary. She thinks I don't know, I thought bitterly. She thinks I can't see the pattern forming again. But I knew. I knew her patterns now, knew the way she carried herself when she thought I wasn't looking, the way her fingers lingered too long on her phone, the way she would leave the house, working late. But the coldness in her voice told me it was never about work. It was about him, Carter. It was always about him. I let her take a few steps up the stairs before I moved, my own footfalls silent but deliberate. "Emma," I called softly, just loud enough to catch her attention. She froze, one hand on the railing, her back turned to me. I could see her stiffen, that familiar tension creeping into her shoulders. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "What?" she asked, her voice thin, almost too casual. "I know what you're doing," I said, my voice low, but the words were sharp, cutting through the calm like a blade. Her face faltered for just a moment, the slightest tremor in her jaw, but she quickly regained her composure. She took a deep breath, forcing a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "What are you talking about?" I crossed the room slowly, my footsteps calculated, deliberate. "You really think I don't know, Emma? You really think you can keep playing this game with me?" My voice had lowered even further, like a murmur in the dark, but the weight of it was enough to make her pause. "You think I can't see? You slipping away from me again. Think I can't see the lies in your eyes?" She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. I had her now. The truth hung between us, suffocating. She knew I wasn't going to let her dance around it anymore. I watched as her expression shifted, from defensiveness to something I couldn't quite place, something close to panic. She took a step back, as if to retreat, but I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I wasn't going to give her the space to lie. Not anymore. "What's it going to be this time, Emma?" I whispered, my voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "How many more lies? How many more excuses? How much longer do you think you can keep pretending?" Her lips trembled, and her eyes flicked to the side as though searching for a way out, some escape. But there was no escape now. Not for her. The tension in the air thickened, and the quiet space between us seemed to swallow all the words I hadn't yet said. Emma's hesitation was palpable, her breath shallow as she stood there, caught in the act, as though she hadn't expected to be found, not so soon, not so decisively. But she had underestimated me, and now the truth was slipping between us like a knife's edge. But this isn't just about Emma anymore. My mind shifted, cold and calculating. It was about Carter. It was about him and the role he played in this toxic dance. He had been the other side of her betrayal, the one she ran to when the silence between us became too unbearable, the one who had fanned the flames of her lies. I had seen the way she spoke of him, the subtle admiration in her voice when she mentioned his name, how she always seemed to perk up at his slightest praise, her eyes alight with a glimmer that wasn't meant for me anymore. But what I hadn't anticipated was the depths of their entanglement. I thought I knew the score, but Carter, ever the sly manipulator, had played his part so well, so convincingly. Now it was his turn to face the consequences. The sting of betrayal began to fade, replaced by something colder, something sharper, a kind of grim satisfaction. I had already orchestrated the next part of this twisted symphony. Carter was going to regret what he had done to me, to us. Carter sat behind his sleek, polished desk the following morning, as though the world around him had never shifted, as though he hadn't been the architect of this wreckage. His suit was immaculate, his posture impeccable, the same practiced arrogance in his expression that I had come to know so well. His office was the kind of sterile corporate space that screamed authority, a space that he had crafted with the kind of power that only someone with influence could wield. But today, it was different. Today, Carter was going to find out just how much his power had failed him. I stood at the door for a moment, my hand on the handle, letting the silence stretch for a few seconds. I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner, the distant murmur of voices from the hallway outside, but it was the stillness inside the office that felt deafening. I wanted him to sense it, to feel the weight of what was coming even before I stepped inside. When I finally opened the door, Carter didn't immediately look up. He was engrossed in whatever task he had on his screen, unaware of the storm brewing in the room behind him. I stepped inside, the sharp click of the door closing behind me breaking the quiet. "James," he greeted without looking up, his voice the same condescending drawl it always carried. "What's the matter? You look like you've got something on. Your mind." I took a slow step forward, feeling the power shift with each movement. The old James, the one who had tolerated his condescension, his superior attitude, was gone. Now, the man who stood before Carter was a quiet storm, a force that would not be swayed. "You're right about one thing," I said, my voice deliberately low, measured. "I do have something on my mind." Carter finally looked up, his brow furrowing as he took in my presence. His eyes flicked to the door, as if wondering whether Emma had sent me in, or if this was just another confrontation between two colleagues. But there was something in the air now, something that made him pause. Maybe it was the quiet intensity in my gaze. Maybe it was the way I had approached him, not with anger, but with something colder, something far more dangerous. "What's this about?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, trying to play it cool, trying to maintain control. But I could see the subtle shift in his posture, the tightening of his jaw, the fleeting flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I took another step closer, my hand resting on the back of one of the chairs across from him. "It's about Emma," I said softly, and watched as his face immediately hardened. "You think I don't know, don't you? You think I've been blind to what's been going on between the two of you?" Carter's lips curled into a tight smile, but it was forced, strained. He tried to cover it with a casual chuckle, but it was hollow, lacking its usual confidence. "Look, James, you're out of line here. If this is some kind of whatever you think it is—" "No," I interrupted, my voice sharp and unwavering. "I'm not out of line. You are. You're out of line for thinking you could come into my life, into my home, and take what's mine. You and Emma, you think you can keep playing this game, but it's over. It ends today." His eyes widened ever so slightly, and I caught the hint of something beneath the surface. Regret. He hadn't expected this. No, he hadn't thought I would catch on this quickly. For all his confidence, Carter was a man of impulse. He had been too eager, too reckless with his pursuit of Emma, thinking he could steal her without consequences. But now, reality was crashing. The days after my confrontation with Carter felt like a chess game, each move deliberate, calculated, as if I were orchestrating the fall of a grand structure. The sense of power that came from finally taking control of the situation, of turning the tables on Emma and her boss was intoxicating, but I knew that I couldn't rush things. Revenge, if done correctly, was an art. It needed time, patience, and precision. I spent my days keeping a close watch on Emma, not just in the way she interacted with me, but in how she behaved around others. I studied her every movement, her every excuse, her every interaction with Carter. I knew she would think she had slipped back into the routine of deceiving me, thinking I was none the wiser, but I wasn't fooled. No, I had been biding my time for far too long to fall into that trap. I would make them both suffer, but I needed to be strategic. Every detail mattered, every gesture, every whispered word. I would leave them no room for escape, no opportunity to deny what had been done. I started with Carter. I knew his weaknesses, the things he was most proud of, and the ones he hid behind a facade of power and prestige. His ego was his most vulnerable point, and like all men driven by arrogance, he underestimated me. He thought I was just the betrayed husband, the one left behind, The fool who would slink away and allow things to blow over. He was wrong. I began to subtly undermine his position, planting seeds of doubt among his colleagues and clients. It wasn't anything overt at first, just a few strategic comments to the right people, small suggestions that made his competence seem questionable, his decisions uncertain. Over time, whispers began to circulate. Carter's reputation, so carefully crafted and polished, began to fray at the edges. It was slow but steady, like a ripple in water that eventually becomes a tidal wave. His empire would crumble, bit by bit, until the pressure mounted and broke him. I made sure I was always there to witness his discomfort, to see the subtle cracks in his armor as he tried to salvage his reputation. I was the ghost in the machine, pulling invisible strings, ensuring that his every move became more desperate. The more he tried to fight back, the more I tightened my grip. But Emma, she was a different matter. Her betrayal was personal, and the way she had so easily justified her actions made the pain even more searing. Her connection to Carter, the way she had allowed herself to be manipulated by him, wasn't just a physical affair. It was an emotional betrayal, one that had cut deep into the heart of our marriage. I knew that to truly make her feel the weight of what she had done, I would need to hit her where it hurt the most, her image, her self-perception. Emma was always careful about her appearance, her status, her reputation. She thrived on validation, on the admiration of others. I would dismantle that, piece by piece. I began by planting seeds of doubt within her social circle. I subtly spread rumors, harmless at first, about her actions, her late nights, the strange behaviors that had started to surface in the past few months. These whispers found their way into the right ears, and soon enough, Emma began to feel the strain. Her friends looked at her differently. Her colleagues whispered behind her, back, and the paranoia began to eat at her. But that wasn't enough. No, I needed her to truly feel the loss, the betrayal of her own choices. She had trusted Carter, used him as a scapegoat to justify her own neglect of our marriage. She thought that she could have it all, the excitement, the affair, and still keep me in the background playing the fool. I would make sure she knew, deep down, that she had lost everything. I staged an accident. It was small, just enough to make her feel the heat of panic without realizing she was walking into my trap. I had her car mysteriously damaged in a hit and run, just enough to make her believe someone was targeting her. And in the midst of the chaos, I had her remember her most recent indiscretions, the late nights with Carter. The subtle hint of fear crept into her eyes. She started to wonder, was this revenge? Was it me taking back control? Or was there something even darker at play? I watched her unravel slowly, piece by piece, as her world started to close in around her. She became agitated, frantic, checking her phone incessantly for messages that weren't coming. She began questioning everything, including herself. The whispers, the rumors, the suspicions, they all began to chip away at her fragile sense of security. She would look at me, sometimes, with a glint of guilt in her eyes, sometimes with outright defiance, but she knew. She knew that I wasn't just letting this go. I was letting her see the consequences of her choices, of her betrayal. And slowly but surely, she began to fear the life she had created. But the most potent part of my plan wasn't yet in motion. The weight of the secret I carried, the suspicion that had gnawed at the back of my mind for so long, finally found its answer in a quiet, unexpected moment. It wasn't the kind of moment I had envisioned. There were no dramatic confrontations or grand revelations. No, this discovery came with a creeping sense of inevitability, as if the universe had decided that the truth could no longer remain hidden. It was so mundane, so ordinary, that it caught me completely off guard. It all started with an innocuous detail: Emma's phone. She had always been careful with her devices. Her phone was an extension of her, guarded and protected with layers of security, passwords, and passcodes. But that day, after months of suspicion, after feeling the cold distance between us widening with each passing day, she left it on the kitchen counter. It was an uncharacteristic lapse, one that felt too convenient, too easy. I had spent hours going back and forth in my mind, questioning whether I was being paranoid, whether my suspicions were rooted in something real or imagined. But when I saw the phone there, abandoned, vulnerable, I knew it was my chance. The temptation was too strong, too all-consuming. The sense that I could finally know for certain whether my fears had any basis, whether she had betrayed me or not, was too powerful to resist. With a steady hand, I picked up the phone, my fingers trembling slightly as I unlocked it. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was fleeting, swallowed up by the urgency to understand the truth. I had long known that Emma's actions had been growing, increasingly erratic. Late nights at the office, unexplained absences, odd silences when I'd ask simple questions. But this was different. This was the moment I had waited for, the final piece of the puzzle. The phone unlocked easily as if she had forgotten to secure it properly this time. My heart pounded in my chest as I navigated to her messages. My eyes skimmed over the innocuous conversations with friends, her colleagues, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I found it, the thread that would unravel everything. It was a series of late-night messages. At first glance, they appeared casual, even mundane, but as I read through them, something in my chest tightened. The messages were from Carter, her boss. The words were laced with flirtation, the kind of playful teasing that had never been directed at me. I could feel the heat of their interactions even through the screen, the playful innuendos, the private jokes that only they shared. It wasn't just the words that shocked me. It was the intimacy in their tone, the closeness that they had cultivated in secret behind my back. One message in particular caught my eye, and my breath caught in my throat. It was from Carter, sent late one night, just after Emma had returned from another work function. His message read, "I can't stop thinking about our last time together. You looked so beautiful. I need to see you again, Emma. Let's make it happen soon. I can't wait much longer." My stomach twisted as I read it again, the weight of those words sinking in. She had told me nothing about this, nothing about their secret meetings, their stolen moments. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was emotional, too. The depth of it hit me like a tidal wave. She had been hiding this from me, concealing it so carefully that I had never even suspected. My hands were shaking now, my pulse racing as I continued scrolling through the messages. The further I went back, the more I uncovered. Pictures exchanged under the guise of innocent fun, plans made for late-night meetups, all hidden behind the veneer of work and professionalism. Each new message was like a fresh wound being opened, deeper than the last. And then there were the phone calls. I found records of late-night calls to Carter, calls that lasted long after I had gone to sleep. The timing was so precise that it was clear Emma had been making these calls with the full intention of hiding them from me. She thought I wouldn't notice. She thought I wouldn't put the pieces together. I felt a chill settle over me as the evidence piled up, suffocating the last remnants of doubt. I had known. Deep down, I had always known. But seeing it all laid out before me in black and white made it real. It made it undeniable. Emma had been betraying me, lying to my face, all while I was still trying to salvage what we had. The anger came slowly at first, a simmering frustration building in my chest, and then, in an instant, it burst forth. I felt betrayed, not just by her, but by my own blind trust. I had been a fool, had allowed myself to believe in the facade she had so carefully built, but now the illusion had shattered. There was no going back. I closed her phone, setting it back down on the counter where I had found it. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing heavily, the weight of what I had discovered pressing down on me like a physical force. The days following my discovery felt like a slow descent into a darker, more calculating part of myself. I had uncovered the evidence, yet there was no immediate rush to confront Emma. No, I had to take my time. If I acted too quickly, too recklessly, I might lose my advantage. The moment needed to be right. Every part of this plan had to unfold precisely as I had envisioned it. I had learned the hard way. Foolishness never paid off. Patience, precision, and control were now my allies. Set about my investigation as if I were an outsider, a detective trying to piece together a puzzle without ever being noticed. Emma still didn't suspect anything. She had no idea that I had discovered the full extent of her betrayal. And that, in a way, gave me power. Power I hadn't realized I craved so desperately until now. The more I learned, the deeper I dug. The more I began to understand the scope of the web she had woven. I spent my days keeping a careful watch on her. Every interaction, every phone call, every email, nothing escaped my notice. I kept track of her movements, both physical and digital. I would watch her leave for work in the morning, and I would know when she came home in the evening. But it wasn't just about surveillance. It was about control. She would never suspect that the very person she had betrayed was now holding the reins. I began following the trail she left behind. Her phone was the key, and with each piece of evidence I collected, I felt like I was gaining an upper hand in this sick game she had forced me to play. The messages from Carter continued, sometimes cryptic, sometimes explicit, but always unmistakably intimate. It wasn't just about the affair, it was the level of manipulation that haunted me. I could see now that she had been drawn in, lured by the promises Carter had made, and somewhere along the way, she had lost herself. She had fallen into his grasp, and her excuses to me were hollow, empty. But as I delved deeper, I began to notice something else, a pattern, a strange detail that piqued my curiosity. There were references in the texts to places and events I had never heard about. They were talking in codes, in ways that suggested much more than just the typical office rendezvous. And the longer I observed, the more I realized that these weren't just innocent meetings. These were calculated, premeditated encounters set up under the guise of professional necessity. I felt a creeping sensation in my gut as I followed the breadcrumbs. There were business trips Emma had told me were nothing important, casual events she claimed were part of her job, yet each one seemed to lead back to Carter, as if he were pulling the strings, dictating her every move. I had seen her, at times, as someone who had just lost her way. But this was different. This was cold, methodical. She wasn't just emotionally compromised. She was making deliberate choices. The investigation grew more intense as I found more evidence. Receipts for expensive dinners in places I knew Carter frequented, photos that hinted at secret rendezvous, and even a flight ticket to a destination that seemed perfectly planned. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Emma and Carter had taken their affair to new levels. There was a level of intimacy they were sharing now that went beyond physical. It was about control, about domination. What unsettled me most was the realization that Emma had been so careless with her lies. So many of her alibis, her excuses, began to unravel when I put the pieces together. She had thought she was smarter than me, that she could keep the truth hidden behind charming smiles and rehearsed words. But in her attempt to maintain control, she had left too many gaps, too many openings. I needed to know more. I couldn't act on suspicion alone, not with something as serious as this. So I took the next step, following her. One Friday afternoon, I knew Emma had a meeting with Carter. I had confirmed it from the calendar in her phone, a meeting she had claimed was crucial for a new project. As soon as she left, I quietly slipped into the car and followed her at a distance, making sure she didn't notice my presence. I was careful, calculating, moving through the streets like a shadow. It wasn't until she drove to a secluded part of the city, a quiet, upscale hotel, that my heart began to race. She parked in the lot, her movements slow, deliberate. I sat in my car watching her get out, adjusting her coat, her expression unreadable. It was like watching a woman walking toward her doom, unaware of the trap that was slowly closing around her. I waited, breathless, as she entered the hotel, disappearing behind the glass doors. The realization hit me hard in that moment. She was here, with him, at his behest, for another of their secret rendezvous. I knew without a doubt that this wasn't just a business meeting. This was something else entirely. I sat there for what felt like hours, the tension in my chest. The weeks that followed my investigation were filled with a quiet, simmering tension. Emma had no idea that I had uncovered her secrets, that I had pieced together her betrayal so meticulously. She was still playing her part, still trying to act as if everything were fine, but the cracks were beginning to show. She was no longer the woman I had married. She was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize, someone whose actions and words no longer matched. I could see it in the way she held herself, slightly more guarded, more distant. There was an air of guilt that clung to her, though she did her best to hide it. It was as if her every movement betrayed a deeper truth, and I could almost feel the weight of her lies hanging in the air between us. Yet she tried to maintain the illusion. The fake smiles, the empty words, the promises of, "We need to work on things." They were all so transparent now. I could hardly look at her without thinking of Carter, of how they had laughed and touched each other behind my back. The thought churned in my stomach, a bitter, nauseating sensation that I could not shake. She had betrayed me once, and I had been willing to forgive. But this was different. She had betrayed me again, this time on a deeper level, and I wasn't sure I could ever go back. I started noticing the little things, discrepancies, fleeting moments that made my blood run cold. Her late nights had become more frequent, the excuses more elaborate, and the texts more secretive. She'd turn her phone face down whenever she left it unattended, her fingers dancing over the screen with an unusual intensity whenever I was near. Her work trips, once simple affairs, began to stretch longer and longer. The shift in her behavior was subtle at first, but I began to see the pattern. She was slipping away again, this time with greater care, with greater purpose. One afternoon, while I was at home, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from a private investigator, someone I had hired in the days after I discovered the first affair. I had paid for his services, though I had never planned to use them, until now. He'd been tailing Emma, gathering intel on her movements, her activities. He knew what I wanted to know. The call was brief, the words crisp and precise. "Mr. Your last name. I have some new information for you. Your wife, she's been seeing him again. Carter, I have the proof." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as I heard those words. It wasn't enough to know that she had betrayed me once. I had to hear the confirmation again, this time from someone who had been following her every move. She hadn't just strayed once. She was doing it again, more carefully this time, more calculated. The investigator told me about the hotel, the same place she had gone to before. The place where she and Carter had met under the guise of business. He described the exact date, the time, the way she had entered the building, all, the while keeping her head low, avoiding attention. She hadn't even been subtle about it this time. She was more brazen, more comfortable in her lies. I felt a surge of rage, but it was tempered by a sense of cold clarity. I had known she was capable of this. I had seen the patterns, the unspoken signals. I had just been hoping foolishly that she would change, that she would come back to me. But I realized, as I held the phone tightly in my grip, that she had already made her decision. She had chosen him. Again. I didn't rush to confront her. No, I needed time to think, to plan, to decide how I would play this out. I had no interest in revenge. At least, not in the way most people might. I didn't want to ruin her. I wanted her to feel the full weight of her actions, to understand that betrayal would never go unpunished. But I wasn't going to be reckless. I had learned too much in the past months to act out of impulse. I would wait, I would watch, and when the time came, she would know the depth of my pain, my disillusionment, and my final decision. For now, I kept my distance, played my part. I acted as if nothing had changed. I spoke to her the way I always had, pretending to believe in the lies she fed me. But inside, I was already preparing for what was to come. I wasn't the same man anymore. The man she had known, the one who had been willing to forgive her once, was gone. In his place was a man who saw through her deception, who understood the depth of her betrayal. And this time, I wasn't willing to forgive. The clock was ticking. The moment for confrontation was coming. And when it arrived, I would make sure she understood just how deeply she had hurt me, and how little she truly understood the consequences of playing with fire. Emma had underestimated me. She had thought she could get away with it again. But she was wrong. And soon she would know just how wrong she was. The days grew heavier as I lived within this lie, wearing the mask of the dutiful husband, while my mind burned with thoughts of revenge. Emma continued her act, and I continued mine. Every evening she would come home, greet me with a smile, and talk about her day, completely oblivious to the fact that I knew everything. Every time she touched me, every kiss she placed on my cheek, I could feel the hypocrisy of it all. My skin tingled with disgust as I imagined her hands on Carter, her body entwined with his, sharing the same affection she had once reserved for me. But I wasn't ready to confront her just yet. No, I needed time to watch, to learn more about their interactions, to gather the final threads of this tangled web. And I needed to prepare for what would come after. I called the private investigator again, requesting more surveillance. I didn't want to be caught off guard. I needed to know every detail, every plan they made, every subtle move she made that indicated her treachery. It wasn't just about gathering evidence now. It was about timing. I had to wait for the right moment, the right weakness. Over the next few weeks, Emma's behavior became even more predictable. She became careless with her lies, slipping in ways that she hadn't before. She would leave her phone unlocked when she went to the bathroom, and once I saw her leave a text message open, the words clear and damning. "Same time tonight. Can't wait to see you, Carter." I took a deep breath and closed the door behind me, my heart pounding. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for, the proof I needed to end everything. Everything she had built, every illusion she had spun, all the lies she had sold. It felt almost too easy. The act of revealing the truth seemed too simple after all the time I had spent trying to convince myself that she might change. That maybe, just maybe, she would realize the depths of her betrayal before it was too late. But she hadn't. And now there was nothing left to do but exact my revenge. I kept quiet that night, acting as though nothing had changed. Emma came home just as she always did, placing her bag down with a tired sigh. She smiled at me, that familiar fake smile that used to comfort me. "How was your day?" she asked, as if she hadn't just texted Carter about their rendezvous. "Same as always," I replied, my voice calm, my eyes never leaving her face. "How was yours?" She hesitated, as if she could sense the undercurrent of something different in my tone. But she quickly recovered, her smile widening. "Busy, but good. Got a lot done at work. I'll make us dinner, okay?" I nodded, watching her carefully as she moved about the kitchen, her back turned to me. Her innocence was gone. I could see the cracks now, the tiny hesitations in her actions that gave away her guilt. I wasn't looking at my wife anymore. I was looking at a woman who had sold me out, who had turned her back on the very vows she had once promised to uphold. After dinner, I casually mentioned that I had a surprise for her. Emma, never one to turn down the possibility of a treat, looked intrigued. "What kind of surprise?" she asked, her voice light, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. "You'll see," I replied, my lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "Let's take a drive." She seemed taken aback by my sudden suggestion, but she didn't protest. I led her to the car, her brow furrowing in mild confusion. I drove in silence, my mind consumed by thoughts of what would come next. The streets blurred around me as I made my way to the same hotel where she had met Carter. I pulled into the parking lot, killing the engine. Emma's eyes widened in surprise. "Why are we here?" she asked, her voice laced with unease now. "I thought you'd enjoy a little change of scenery," I said, my tone cool, detached. "But why here?" she repeated, her voice faltering as the realization began to set in. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I grabbed my phone from the console and turned on the video. As the video played, Emma's face drained of color. The footage, clear as day, showed her entering this very hotel with Carter, hand in hand, her smile intimate, as though no one was watching. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, but I was quicker. I took it from her, holding it firmly in my hand. "You really thought you could get away with this, didn't you?" I asked, my voice colder than I had ever heard it before. She tried to speak, but the words were caught in her throat, a mixture of guilt and fear swirling in her eyes. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice shaking. I was just—" "No," I interrupted, my voice unwavering. "You weren't just anything. You were selfish. You were greedy. And now I'm the one who's been paying for your lies." I felt no anger, no rage in that moment, only a deep, consuming calm. The years of heartache, the sleepless nights, the uncertainty about what had really been going on. I couldn't stop thinking about the tangled mess of lies Emma had spun around me. There was an unsettling calm in the way she went about her day-to-day life, oblivious to the fact that I had already discovered her betrayal. I had crossed the threshold where ignorance could still be feigned, and I had no intention of playing the fool any longer. I had set the investigation in motion quietly, careful not to alert Emma to the fact that I was watching. Every detail mattered. My private investigator, an old acquaintance I had enlisted the moment I first suspected something wasn't right, had been invaluable. His eyes were everywhere, watching Emma's every move like a shadow. Each text message, each late-night rendezvous, each carefully constructed excuse that she thought she could hide from me, all of it was recorded, filed, and delivered to me in cold, undeniable fact. At first, it was like a slow-moving storm, building with every phone call, every hotel booking, every interaction with Carter. There was no mistaking what was happening. Emma's late-night business meetings were no longer innocent. The dinners she claimed were work-related had all the markings of something else, something much darker. I knew she thought she was clever, that she thought I wouldn't catch on, but there was no hiding from the truth. The investigator had caught her twice now, entering a luxury hotel with Carter, once under the pretense of a work retreat, and another time as she'd excused herself for a business dinner. But those excuses didn't matter to me anymore. They were hollow. The footage didn't lie. It showed her laughing, a look in her eyes that wasn't for me. It was for him. The way she leaned into him, the way she allowed herself to be touched. By him, it all confirmed my worst fears. Each discovery felt like a punch to my gut, and yet I couldn't pull myself away from the investigation. The more I uncovered, the more I wanted to know. I needed all the pieces, every fragment of truth, so that when the time came, I wouldn't be the one left in the dark. I needed to see it all, every single moment that had been hidden from me. I spent sleepless nights in front of my computer, scrolling through the pictures and videos, watching Emma's lies unfold in front of my eyes. I watched as she and Carter entered that hotel room once again, the door closing behind them as if they were two actors performing a scene that was far too familiar. The sound of their laughter echoed in my ears, a sound that once used to bring warmth to my heart, now a cruel reminder of what I had lost. I knew I had to confront her, but not yet. I needed to be patient. I needed to keep my composure for just a little longer. I couldn't allow myself to make any rash decisions. The time wasn't right, not yet. I would wait for the final piece, the moment that would break her facade wide open. One day, when Emma came home after another one of her business trips, I knew it was time to put my plan into action. She entered the house with a smile that faltered the moment she saw my expression. I had never looked at her like that before. It wasn't anger, not yet. But there was something in my eyes, a coldness that she couldn't ignore. "Hey, how was your trip?" I asked, the words falling flat, like I was just going through the motions. "It was good," she replied, her voice slightly strained. She hung her coat up, avoiding my gaze. "Long day, though?" "Yeah, I bet," I said, moving toward the kitchen, pretending to prepare dinner, though my hands were trembling. I couldn't show her I was affected. Not yet. I needed to keep this controlled. "I picked up your favorite wine," she added, trying to steer the conversation into familiar territory, her voice laced with an effort that seemed all too forced now. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat down at the kitchen table, and I slowly pulled out the folder that contained the evidence. She had no idea what was coming. I watched her out of the corner of my eye as she uncorked the wine, her back to me, the motion of her hands slow and deliberate, perhaps trying to convince herself that everything was fine. But I had already seen too much. The lies were already unraveling in my mind, and I couldn't bring myself to pretend anymore. Without a word, I slid the folder across the table toward her. She stopped pouring the wine, her breath catching in her throat as she looked down at it. Then, slowly, she turned toward me, her face pale, eyes wide. "What is this?" she whispered, though she knew. I didn't answer her immediately. I just waited, watching the realization dawn in her eyes as she opened the folder and began flipping through the photographs, the text messages, the hotel bookings, every little detail of her infidelity laid bare. I watched her face contort. With panic, her fingers trembling as she turned each page, unable to comprehend how it had all come to light. "You were right about one thing," I said finally, my voice low, calm. The evidence was clear, undeniable, and the sting of betrayal still burned within me. Yet despite the rising fury inside, I knew that vengeance would not be served in haste. This was not a simple matter of confronting Emma and demanding answers. No, my revenge would be more intricate, more devastating in its precision. I would make her feel the weight of her choices, and I would do it slowly, carefully, so that when the truth finally hit her, there would be no escaping it. I began to plan with methodical precision, using every moment of calm to gather my thoughts, ensuring each step would be executed flawlessly. The weeks following the discovery of Emma's affair were quiet, eerily so. Emma didn't suspect a thing. I had learned the art of deception well. Every glance, every word was calculated. I played the role of the dutiful husband to perfection. But beneath the surface, my mind was working overtime, weaving a web that would ensnare her at the perfect moment. I had the evidence. I had the private investigators' reports, the hotel records, the text messages that no longer needed explanation. The next step was to make Emma believe she had won, that she had escaped my suspicion. I would let her believe I was naive, that I was unaware of the magnitude of her betrayal. But in truth, I was already 10 steps ahead. The first part of my plan was subtle. I began to change. Slowly, imperceptibly at first. I became distant, a little less available. When she would ask about my day, I would give vague, neutral answers. I no longer sought her out for conversation as much, and I noticed her eyes linger on me, searching for something she couldn't quite place. A flicker of doubt crossed her face whenever I wasn't home exactly when she expected, or when I came back with a new look of quiet confidence, as though the world had shifted, and I was no longer the man she knew. She noticed the change. She had to. But she didn't question it directly. She didn't want to. I could see it in her eyes, the guilt, the fear, hidden beneath the carefully constructed mask of a woman who thought she had everything under control. The next part of my plan was more direct. I began to spend more time with friends, some old acquaintances from work, a few I hadn't seen in years. These meetings were innocent enough, at least to her, but they served a greater purpose. I needed to make Emma think that I was rebuilding something she had never known I had lost. I needed her to wonder, just a little bit, if perhaps I had found someone else. I wasn't seeing anyone. Not yet. But I made sure Emma knew that I was socializing, that I was no longer confined to the home, waiting for her return. I wanted her to feel the subtle fear of losing me, not just as a partner, but as someone who could move on from her betrayal. It was in these moments, when I'd mention an old friend's name or casually bring up something I'd done with someone, that I could see the cracks in her mask. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the panic just below the surface. One evening, I came home later than usual, smelling faintly of cologne and expensive whiskey. Emma was sitting in the living room, watching TV, trying to act casual. But I could feel her eyes on me. I hadn't even planned this move. It was instinct. I walked past her, leaving her with nothing but the sound of my footsteps on the floorboards. "Are you seeing someone?" she asked finally, her voice cracking in the stillness of the room. I paused, not turning to face her. "Why would you think that?" Her silence was more telling than any words could have been. She knew the truth. But she needed me to say it. She needed to hear the confirmation, and I wanted her to. "No reason," she replied, but the hesitation in her voice betrayed her. "Good," I said simply, still not facing her. "I'm glad we're on the same page." And just like that, I left her with that seed of doubt. I watched as she processed the interaction, saw the unease in her posture, the way she stared at me longer than usual, as though trying to gauge what I was thinking. The more I made her question me, the less she could focus on her own deceit. But all of this was leading up to the final act, the confrontation. I wasn't ready to do it yet, not while Emma still believed she had the upper hand. I needed to make her feel as though she was safe, that the storm had passed, so when it hit her, it would strike with the force of a hurricane. Over the following days, I began to plant more deliberate signs. I would leave my phone out on the table with open text conversations from work friends, ensuring she would catch a glimpse. I made sure that my schedule appeared increasingly busy, hinting at things I was doing, but never fully explaining. Each detail was intended to create a sense of unpredictability, to make her feel the tension of not knowing what I was truly up to. And then, one night, after a particularly late meeting with friends,